Hello and welcome to the second installment of the Managing in Times of Change and Transition series. I'm Vanessa Laurel with Capacity for Health, and I will be the facilitator for today's session. We have a few housekeeping items to go over before we begin. Participants are currently on mute. If you have not done so, please go ahead and enter your access code and PIN so that you can hear us and fully participate in today's webinar. When you dialed the conference call number, you were prompted to enter your access code, and then the system prompts you to enable audio controls by entering your PIN. During this discussion section at the end, please raise your hand and I will unmute your line. Remember, you must enter your access code and audio PIN in order for me to do this. If you prefer, you can also use the question/chat feature, which is located on your right-hand side under the audio heading. Please note that the webinar will be audio recorded and published on our website at www.capacityforhealth.org. This webinar is hosted by Capacity for Health, a project of API-AHF with offices in San Francisco and Washington, D.C. We are funded by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention to provide free resources, trainings, webinars, and one-on-one tailored capacity building assistance in three main areas that you see on your screen. Today's webinar falls under the Organizational Infrastructure and Program Sustainability content area. We also do work in other categories such as evidence-based interventions and public health strategies and monitoring and evaluation. We are very pleased to have Doris Roach join us today and present on the topic of managing teams. Doris, will you please go ahead and introduce yourself?
Hello, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be with you today. I'm looking forward to doing the second of a 3-webinar series on managing in times of change and transition. And so before we get started, I just want to make sure that the slides are up and running.
Yes, they are.
Awesome. Okay. So as I said, this is the second of a 3-part series on managing in times of change and transition. And it's a timely subject because many AIDS service organizations have been experiencing significant changes over the past 2 or 3 years. We've noticed a number of organizations just being impacted by the economy, by seeing their grant awards and individual donations being significantly reduced. Staff turnover continues to be a reality for many organizations. And last year, we had the White House release its national HIV/AIDS strategy, and so now a lot of organizations are waiting to see how the goals and strategies of that plan will impact or change HIV prevention and care efforts at the state and local level. And also a lot of organizations now are exploring alliances and collaborations with new partners, which is also bringing on a lot of change and transition in the arena as well. So when we're looking at the issue of managing in times of change and transition, what is significant is that a lot of major leading change management experts say that 70 to 75%, there's a 70 to 75% let me say that again, 70 to 75% chance that your change efforts are going to fail. And the reason why that is because change efforts tend to focus on the nuts and bolts and the technical aspects of change, but not on the impact of change on the people that actually have to implement those changes. Because everyone has a different capacity to adapt, and continual or large-scale changes can be unsettling. It can cause stress in the workplace, and if those factors are not addressed, it can significantly undermine organizational effectiveness and quality delivery of services. So in the second of, let's see if I can get this change here. All right, there we go. In this second series, we're going to be looking at managing teams through change and transition. And our objectives for today are looking at the impact of organizational change on the team level, looking at the difference between change and transition. These are 2 different topics, 2 different issues that need to be addressed. And in that regard, we'll be looking at the Bridges transition model and the change curve, which looks at the various aspects of how change affects our teams as you're going through change and transition. The issue of resistance inevitably arises, so we'll be looking at team resistance and looking at how to communicate to address those issues that occur when managing change. And lastly, we're going to be looking at the topic of emotional intelligence with regards to managing teams through change and transition. So before moving on to the webinar, I have a question for you. I just want to get a sense of who's out there and what's happening. And my question to you is, are you managing a team through an organizational change? So some of you may be, maybe you're not. Or you might be kind of considering a change that's coming down the pike, or you might be an organization where change is just a fact of life. So I'm just curious where you are in the mix. So if you could just respond or select one of those options so that I have a sense of where you are. Okay. So, well, in terms of the polling question, it looks like no one's responding to where you are. So we're just going to go ahead and move on and address the Managing Team webinar. And so once I get the, there we go. Thank you. So I'm going to, all right. So with regards to managing change, the thing that I want to say is that there are two sides of managing change. There's the technical side as manager, that's the strategizing, the decision-making, the reorganization in response to change. And then there's the human side, the team members that you have to manage, the information that has to be communicated, supporting people's reactions and providing them with the tools that they need in order to effectively manage the change. So I do have another question for you, and I hope you answer this one. And that is, if you are a manager that is managing change, how are you managing the change? And so let's see. Thank you. Are you managing the change well? Are you thriving with the change? Is your team thriving? Are you experiencing up and down reactions, both within yourself and with your team? Is the management of the change from your perspective just not going well? You're just having a lot of difficulties and challenges. Are you not so sure? You're not quite sure where you stand in the mix. So it's important as a manager to be in touch with how you are interacting and dealing with the change. And I'm just curious in terms of who's out there, where you are. So a lot of you are saying that it's up and down, and that is a very normal reaction to managing change. And because managing change begins with you. And before I move on, what I want to say is, Vanessa, are we able to see the slides? Hello?
Let me change it to you so they can see the slides.
Oh, okay, great, because I couldn't see it, and I just want to make sure. There it is. Great. Are my slides up there?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay. So the reason why I asked this, and the majority of you were saying, or all of you were saying that it's been up and down, is that you're human too. And let's face it, managing change is not an easy task. It's a time when you have to be at the top of your game because the tasks that you're changing are unique and can be inherently more difficult than normal. So it really makes sense for you to start with acknowledging how you're feeling about the change, dealing with your own concerns about the change, because your staff is going to be looking to you as a role model and looking to you to see how you're dealing with it in order to react. So some things to be thinking about from your individual perspective is thinking about, what has this time been like for me? You know, has this been challenging for me? And most of you are saying up and down. Also, looking at the past, what has worked well? It could be both professionally but also personally. When I've managed change in the past, what have I been able to do well? So some of the things that might come into play you might have done in the past with your staff is dropping in and just having informal conversations, making sure that you have regular staff meetings to make sure that the information is communicated on a regular basis. Also, to look at what has been most challenging for you as a manager? And this could be those people that really push your buttons, ordinarily during normal times, but during change and transition, they're pushing your buttons even more because you're feeling a sense of uneasiness or anxiousness. So just getting in touch with that. And also, what are some of the welcome or unwelcome surprises that you've seen? And that could be the person who's always been a star performer that you could always depend on, all of a sudden is just not stepping up to the plate, and that could be a surprise to you. So it's really important, once you get in touch with where you are, to help you, as you get in touch with where you are, then you can also begin to get in touch with how your staff is feeling. So before we move on to looking more at this change process, it's important for us to make a distinction between change and transition. So William Bridges is my change guru. He wrote a seminal book on called Managing Transitions, and if you're a manager managing change, this is absolutely a must-have book for your bookshelf. And what he says is that change is a one-time occurrence. It's usually an initiating act or event. We change jobs, we change clothes, we change living environments. And it's a change from or a shift from one person, place, or thing to another. So in other words, change is transitional, it's outcome-oriented, it tends to come on more rapidly. So once the change has been initiated or started, the experience of moving from that change state to the new place, that's what we call transition. And the transition process is an ongoing process. It's the process of learning how to let go of the way things were and learning how to embrace what's new. So it's a state of shifting from one state to another, which tends to be much more of an internal process. It's much more psychologically oriented, and it takes more time. It takes time. And so in other words, change is the shift from the external situation, the thing that has changed and can happen quickly, to the reorientation process, which is the transition that people need to make in order to respond to the change, incorporate the change, and accept the change. And this can take time. So from a managerial standpoint, this means that you need to understand the psychology of change. And the psychology of change is really about, you know, the emotions, the shifts that people have to make internally in order to adapt to the change. When it comes to managing change, managers are conditioned to determining, evaluating, and driving the task to completion. But change also requires how people are responding to the change and managing and supporting them through that process. The Bridges transition model is a useful model for understanding what people go through when going through change and transition. So let's take a look at that. So what he says is that any change process in which people are going through a transition involves three phases. The first is the ending phase, and from a managerial standpoint, this is about helping people come to terms with what is no longer going to be. So it could be you've been in one location for a number of years and you're moving to a new location. So the ending is no longer being where you once were. You could be having a leadership change. Your executive director, who's the founding director, decides that they're going to transition out of that role. So it's transitioning into a new leadership model. So that's an ending. So practically speaking, from a managerial standpoint, you have to support your people in understanding that, or understanding that there is an ending happening and coming to terms with that ending. In the neutral zone phase, this is the phase where things are not quite settled in. There is, things are not established yet. The change is not institutionalized. The new leader is in, but is looking at the lay of the land and starting to think about changes, but hasn't made some concrete decisions yet. This is the phase where you've received news that there is a funding cut, but there are decisions being made about who's going to get laid off, what resources have to be cut back, which program services need to be reorganized. And this is a phase where people can get very anxious and nervous because things aren't the way they used to be. It's an adjustment to the new normal. And so what is that? And it's also a phase that takes time at a time when you really need to get things done. So we can become very impatient during this phase. Then eventually, as you move out of that phase of feeling your way, understanding what the impact is going to be, understanding the new policies and procedures, there comes a time when it becomes institutionalized. People have a clear idea of what's going on, and you're in that phase of new beginnings, and it is the time from a managerial standpoint to begin celebrating what you've been able to accomplish, the fact that you've survived the funding cut, the fact that you have a new executive director, the fact maybe that you incorporated successfully with another program and the programs are being delivered successfully. So before we go on, I have another question for you, and that is I'd like to get a sense of what phases of transition you're managing. So that polling question is, I would like to know what phase are you managing? Are you managing an ending of some sort? Are you in that neutral zone phase where things are not quite set? Are you in that phase of establishing new beginnings? You've kind of gotten, or you're moving towards that place of institutionalizing the change. The new leader has come on board. You have a better sense of what their vision is. You've dealt with the funding cut, and everything's done. Okay, so none of you are dealing with the neutral zone phase, but a lot of you are dealing with endings, and the majority of you are dealing with new beginnings. So what I'd like to do now is look at each of these phases individually and begin to think about, from a managerial standpoint, what are the kinds of things you need to be paying attention to. So in the ending phase, which 33% of you said that you're undergoing, here is where you're dealing with the losses. You're dealing with employees that are feeling a sense of loss in one form or another. And that loss can manifest in feeling a sense of loss because some colleagues that they've been working with for a long period of time have been laid off as a result of a funding cut. Or maybe there's a new manager because there's a new leadership team that's come on board. So here is where we're leaving the unknown. We're leaving the established relationships. We're leaving the way in which we knew how to work with others, and we have to develop new relationships and new ways of being. And this can often feel threatening. This can often make people feel anxious. So you as manager have to recognize that that's a normal part of the process. People are going to feel a sense of loss. There can also be a sense of loss of meaning. So let's say there is a new leader on board with a new vision. You know, people tend to join nonprofit organizations because they are committed to the vision. And if the vision is changed, then there's a loss of connection to the vision. Then that can have a real impact on morale and commitment to the change process. And sometimes this can be very, very subtle and not spoken, but enormously powerful, because if you're not committed to the organizational mission, then you're not going to show up 100%. And you as manager are going to have difficulties getting your team to produce in the way they need to produce in order to get the job done. Also during the ending phase, there's a sense of loss of control, especially when you have an outside force that's coming in saying, look, we're going to remove $1 million from your budget. And as a result, that means that you have to substantially reduce the number of services that you're providing that are fundamental services, that are much needed services. And so this sense of, wow, I have no control over the impact or decisions that are being made that affect the work that I'm doing. So here is where, as manager, you need to be sensitive to the fact that people are going to feel some varying degrees of loss because the landscape has changed. And inevitably, people are going to feel a sense, go through some stages of grief. And there's a wonderful body of work by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. She wrote a seminal book on death and dying, and it's another book for your bookshelf. And what she just does is describe the stages of grief for people that are dying. And her work has now been translated into the organizational development field. And what they have found that when people are going through endings as a result of changes or decisions that have been made in the workplace, they go through similar stages of grief as described in her work. So let's look at those stages using the change curve model and incorporating the William Bridges model of endings, neutral zones, and new beginnings. So the ending phase, there's going to be a lot of emotions that will come into play, anywhere from sadness, feeling a sense of personal loss because one of their colleagues is leaving, or departmental positions have been eliminated, or where colleagues have worked together for a long time and they've developed close connections, and those things are, that connection is no longer there. So there's a sadness about the way of doing things no longer being present. And one of the things as manager you need to recognize is that this is a reasonable thing for people to mourn their losses. There could also be a sense of guilt that, survivor's guilt. I got to keep my job and my colleague did not. And I'm just feeling like, wow, it could happen to me at any time, that I'm feeling guilty. And that is a very normal reaction. Anger is also very normal, and it can also be challenging to deal with, especially if it's not being expressed in a constructive way. So as a manager, being able to allow the full range of emotions that people are feeling as they're going through the change and transition process, especially during endings, the anxiety that can arise, and managing that. And the key way of managing that is giving people constructive outlets to talk about how they're feeling and letting those emotions be expressed. So what I'd like to do before moving on is ask you yet another question to get you thinking about you as manager and how your teams are reacting. So the polling question here is, how is your team coping with the change? Are they thriving? Are they doing very well? Are they kind of up and down? Some days they're doing terrifically, other days they're not. Are your teams just not managing the change well? It's a major change, and significant loss of funding or something terrible really is happening to the organization, and they're having a hard time coping with it. You may not be sure how your managers are managing. Okay, so a lot of up and downs, and not so great. And this is, depending on the kind of change that's happening, this is a very normal reaction. So having your finger on the pulse of where your team is at is part of you developing some strategies about how to help them manage that transition. So returning back to the slides, what I'd like to talk about now is reacting to or responding to the reactions of the emotional reactions of employees, and talk about some strategies that you can implement as manager. So one of the things that is really important is not to wait for your employees to talk to you, but to be proactive, to go to your employees and ask for what are their questions, what are their concerns, including those people that might be very quiet and withdrawn. They may not be willing to talk about what's going on, but for you to go to their office and ask, how are you doing with the change? How are things happening? Is there anything that I can do to support you, is a good way for people to help feel supported through the process. And that includes asking them about how they're feeling, asking them about their opinions. It's really about communication. And the more that you communicate and connect, the more people will feel supported through the change process that's happening. And a lot of you were saying that your teams are not managing the change well. So this is really going to be essential for you. The other thing is that as a manager, you really have to resist becoming defensive, because sometimes you might get very strong reactions. why is this happening? We're tired of all these changes, and we're tired of all these cuts, and you mean what? You want me to take on more work? And, you're human too. So part of helping to manage your team and to establish trust and to help your team feel supported is to manage your own defensiveness. Like, I'm doing my job, I'm doing the best that I can, but being open to the full range of emotions that are being expressed in constructive ways. The other thing is visibility, and this is really truly about having an open door policy, not just opening up your door and people knowing that you really don't want people to walk through it. It's having an open door and being truthful about that door being open. It's walking around and making sure you're visible. So I'm remembering one executive director who took on an organization that was going through enormous change and made it a point every day for 10 minutes just to walk around the office, just to be visible, so that people saw her, and if they wanted to pull her aside and ask questions, that she was available, and it really made a substantial difference. Providing information, I cannot say enough that you cannot provide too much information when you're going through change and transition. The more information you provide people, the better. And it's better for them to say too much information versus not having enough information, because when our teams do not know what's going on, what inevitably happens is stories start to happen, gossip occurs, and that can really substantially undermine team morale. So the more you're transparent, the more you share about what's going on, the more frequently you do that, it's a significant tool to help build trust and to help your team feel supported. And above all, patience, patience, patience. Patience with yourself and patience with the full range of emotions and reactions that you're going to be experiencing or are experiencing with your team members. So to that end, I want to talk about resistance, because that's a significant factor when we're talking about change and transition. It's definitely a part of the process. It can also be one of the most challenging aspects of managing change and transition. So here, the kinds of reactions you might be encountering is anxiety, self-absorption, stress, depression, anger, fear. Questions like, why are they doing this? Again, this is crazy. Whose idea is this anyway? This will never work. Those kinds of reactions are pretty typical. In response, in dealing with resistance, your role as manager, your greatest tool is to listen, 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 and really hear what's being said on your team. It's also a time where you have to drum up a lot of empathy, even when it can be challenging, because people need to feel like you're understanding what they're going through, that you're putting yourself in their shoes. Here is also, when there's resistance, is helping people to understand what's ending and what's not ending. So for example, I was dealing with a team, and I mentioned this in the last webinar, that was moving from a location that they had been in for 35 years. And some of the members of that team had been at that other location for like 30 of the 35 years. So there was a lot of anxiety, there was a lot of fear. And one of the things with working, when we were working with that team around the ending, was identifying, yes, the location was ending, but the team and what the organization represented and the work that was being done, that wasn't ending. And that helped to start to relieve some of the anxiety. The other thing that can help when you're dealing with resistance is also giving people a part to play, really soliciting people's feedback and ideas, and as a way of helping them feel like it's not just something that's happening to them, and that may very well be the case, but they also have some part to play in the transition that's being made. Now, inevitably, I must mention this, that you are going to have that difficult employee that no matter what you do, no matter what you say, no matter how much attention you give them, it's just not going to be enough, and you're going to feel like you're hitting your head against the wall. And what happens, because managing change and transition, or change and transition, can bring out a heightened sense of anxiety. If you have an employee who was already difficult to manage prior to the change and transition, it's going to, their behavior might begin to escalate. So here, as a manager, it goes back to managing yourself and finding the fortitude to separate out the personality versus what's actually being done. And so that can be a challenge, but it's absolutely necessary, because your job as manager, managing a change or transition, is getting your employees to do what they need to do to execute that change. So when you're dealing with someone who's difficult, who's complaining a lot, look at, okay, how are they performing? Are they getting the job done? Versus who they are and their behavior and their personality traits. And in that, with that regard, focusing on communicating, even though it might be challenging, with that person, and communicating with that person a lot. So what are your concerns? How can I help you and support you? What additional information do you need? Do you need some additional training? Do you need some additional resources that we can get if we don't have that? And making sure that you're listening to the feedback and hearing what the person is saying, even though it might be challenging to do that. Ultimately, the bottom line is, as manager, the job has to get done. That is the ultimate objective. So if the employee is not performing, then it may be time to hold them accountable for the work that needs to be done, and you might need to be having some different kinds of conversations around performance improvement. And when you're dealing with this kind of employee, it's really important to make sure you're documenting your conversations, have a paper trail, and if it's leading to a place where they're just not managing the change well, you might have to manage them out the door. You want to make sure that those efforts on your part are very well documented. So I want to also mention, and I've said this several times before, but I want to say it again, that part of managing change and transition is, as a manager, is you have to manage yourself. And what can be challenging is if there is a change occurring, a shift in leadership, a policy that's being implemented, if you're not in agreement with that shift, your staff is going to pick it up. They're going to see that your attitude, they're going to see where you're coming from, and then you're really going to have some challenging issues at play. So it's really important that you be convinced that the change is needed. If you're not convinced, to get the information you need in order to move to that arena so that you can be congruent with your staff. And then stepping into the shoes of your staff, trying to see things from their perspective will also help you manage change. The other thing I want to say is that each organizational culture is different, and respecting your organizational culture around communication. So making sure that there are effective ways that you're communicating. So if you're an email culture, you might want to send out regular email communications about what's going on, have regular staff meetings, in addition to those informal conversations that you need to have in order to keep your staff well informed about what's happening. So now I'd like to move to the neutral zone, and none of you said that you were managing the neutral zone part of transition, but I think it bears mentioning, especially for those that were in the ending phase and about to move into the neutral zone. Here is where there can be a great deal of frustration because things are not settled. People don't know exactly what they're supposed to be doing because the procedures have shifted or changed. And here is where a great deal of patience on your part as manager is going to be required because your staff may be feeling a great deal of frustration and uncertainty. And as manager, you want to get the job done. And so there can be some impatience, like, let's get on with it already. Let's get this done. But that neutral zone process needs to be given some space. People need to be given that opportunity to make mistakes, to shift, to ask questions. Here's where there should be a lot of give and take and feedback. I also want to say about the neutral zone phase in terms of managing your staff, this is a really creative time. And here's a time when you can get some feedback from your staff and ideas about how to do things differently, which will also help them feel part of the process and can also help you do your job more effectively. So, for example, I was working with one team where they were facing significant funding cuts, and the managerial staff asked the team, okay, here's what we're facing. This is what we have to cut back. We really want to save people's jobs. What are some of your ideas about how to cut back? And the team came up with some really creative ideas. There was input and there was buy-in, and everybody cooperated because they felt a certain sense of control about what was happening, what was being implemented during this neutral zone phase. So they were able to come up with some really creative ideas that later became institutionalized and part of the work that they did. So some suggestions as a manager managing a team through this neutral zone phase is it's really important to keep explaining the purpose of the change as a plan in response to the change, especially if it's a funding cut. Continuing to support the commitment to the change. Here's the time when you really have to step up the encouragement encouragement efforts. Here's where you're working on helping people get the skills, get the tools, get the resources, get the information that they need in order to navigate this very, very tricky zone. And again, without wanting to belabor the point, is patience, patience, patience. So part of the ongoing conversations during this period of time is helping your staff move from that period of that phase of that perspective of avoidance to acceptance of the change. So you might get a lot of why questions. Why is this happening? You know, why do we have to do it this way? And you as manager changing or reframing those conversations to, okay, what are the new opportunities that this change is going to provide for us? You know, here are the new, and maybe stating them. You know, we're going to be able to deliver services to a different population if you're expanding your services. If you're merging with another organization, here are these resources that they have that we didn't have before. So continuously reframing. Helping employees move from the wisdom, what's in it for me, around the change, how is this going to affect me, to, okay, by making this change, even though it's been forced upon us, let's say it's a funding cut, to, okay, here are some problems that are going to be solved as a result of our being able to cut back in response to the change. Here's some of the things that can happen. So reframing those conversations, reframing it to what I can do to help. What it looks like in the present, even though it's not the way that it used to be. What are we doing now? So it's very, very important for you as manager to help your team move into this place of acceptance through reframing language. So on that note, I'd like to now talk about new beginnings, and a lot of you mentioned that you're in that phase of new beginnings with your team. And here is where the change is becoming institutionalized. There is a movement towards acceptance because you have to accept the change. And it's more about, oh, I get it, that kind of reorientation. Okay, okay, now I understand what the policy is. Now I understand how this works. I have a better sense of how to be delivering these new services in a way that I didn't before when I was in the neutral zone. And from a managerial standpoint, really important to hold steady to the plan. You know, this is what we're doing, this is where we're going, because what will happen, it's human nature, is that once you let your foot off the gas pedal, you know, people will just coast back into their old habits. So part of your role as manager is to keep it going, keep people informed about what they need to be doing, what the new plan of action is, what the direction is, and support people's commitment to the change by helping them to see the benefits and providing them with the resources and the support to keep going, moving forward. So here's some things to think about, and these questions are taken from that Managing Transitions book that I recommend, written by William Bridges. here's some questions to be asking yourself. And that is, are you accepting the fact that sometimes people are going to be ambivalent towards the new beginning that you're trying to implement? Have you taken care of the endings? Have you given your staff an opportunity to talk about what's ending, to talk about how that's affecting them, to talk about their feelings? And in that neutral zone, are you trying to force that new beginning before it's ready? Or are you giving your staff enough time to make the adjustment, to learn the new skills, to get accustomed to the new leadership that's on board before they can get to that place of celebration and acceptance? And then the last two questions are about communication and making sure, have I clarified what's going on? Have I communicated why we're having to change? Have I done it in a way that's effective, that, that represents the organizational culture and that's going to reach the people in a way, your team members, in a way that they're actually going to hear and incorporate that information. So on that note, what I want to do now is transition into the issue of emotional intelligence. And when we talk about emotional intelligence as distinguished from intellectual intelligence, IQ versus EQ, IQ is really about, it's the smarts that we have, how intelligent we are. But EQ is about how we use that intelligence, how we use that smart. And on a team level, in terms of the team IQ, it's really how your team functions in such a way that everyone's best talents and abilities are contributed in a way that it's functioning, able to get the work done in a good way, and that people are working well together in the face of change. So as I go through this section of the presentation, I would like you to begin thinking about your team and where do you think they're strong and where are there some opportunities for development so that for you as manager, you can, after taking this webinar, you can begin to think about, okay, what do I want to go back and work on? And also, what do I want to acknowledge so that my team is really aware of their strengths in the face of what's happening? So there are three major components with emotionally intelligent teams. The first element is trust, that the team members trust each other, that there is a sense of group identity, that people really feel committed to each other as a team and to the work that the team is doing, and that the team is working well, group efficacy. There are 7 elements, and we're going to go through each of these, and here's where I want you to think about your own team, especially in the face of managing change and transition, is how the team identifies itself, what is the degree of motivation with the team, what is the degree of emotional awareness on your team, how well do they communicate, how well are they dealing with the stress, how well do they deal with conflict, and what is the level of optimism with regards to the team in terms of being able to navigate the change and deal with the transitions that are taking place. So the first is team identity. And team identity is about pride. How does the team feel about itself as a team? How do they feel about their connections within the team? And it's also about the level of respect that the team has for the diversities of talent and skills that are on the team. And here is where, is there a degree of loyalty? Is the team supportive of one another? Or are you as manager having to continue to foster that support? So when team members have identified with the team, it becomes a problem-solving organism. All those different aspects of the team, all those skills, all those points of view are working together, and the team becomes larger than the sum of its parts. So rather than, having stars in the team, which all teams have, even the stars are working in cooperation with one another in order to make that change happen, in order to deliver the work in an effective way. So think about your own team, and what is the level of team identity? What is that level of pride? So that's going to give you some indication of how well your team is managing change, and you might have to do some team building. The next element is team motivation, and here is about the energy of the team to get the job done, especially when your team has been impacted by a loss of a member or members, where workloads have shifted and people have to take on more than they have in the past. You know, how motivated are they to get the work done, to cooperate with one another in order to readjust and work together in order to make the change happen with those reduced resources. So the team has to believe in the work and that the work makes a difference, and that is going to be a high degree of indication of whether or not your team is motivated. So the third factor is emotional awareness, and this is about how well do your team members accept and value one another. And this is, you know, how do they deal with both the positive emotions that will come up and reactions that will come up in teams, as well as the negative emotions. You know, how well does your team react to that team member who's willing to call things as it is, or name the things that you don't want to name, the elephants in the room, as well as the team members that are always looking for the positive reframe. So how does your team manage the range of reactions, and how well do they respect one another with regards to those differing opinions? Is there room and space for those different opinions to be expressed and valued and talked about, or are they shoved underneath the carpet and pushed to the side? Because if that is happening, that's going to impact on the level of trust, and as a result will impact your ability to navigate your team through change and transition in a way that they feel like they can trust you to come to you with their concerns and their feedback. The next level is stress tolerance, and that's about how do your team members support each other both professionally and personally through change. Change inevitably brings up a lot of upheaval. So for example, I was working with a team where there was one team member during a time when the organization was going through a lot of changes that her child became critically ill. And this was a highly functional team. And what they did is they stepped up to the plate for this team member because she had always stepped up for them. So they were willing to take on some of her training work. They were willing to handle some of the load while she was addressing that personal crisis. They were willing to take on much more on their already full plates as a way of helping her manage her personal stress as well as the team stress in terms of working together and really pulling together to make what needed to happen happen. The next is conflict resolution, and when you're dealing with managing change and transition, conflict is inevitably going to arise, especially during that neutral zone when people are trying to figure things out. People can get very impatient, and there can be a heightened sense of emotion. So how well does your team manage stress? And I'm not being facetious here, but are they yelling? Do they yell at each other? Do you have hostile relationships on your teams that are not being resolved? Or conversely, on the other end of the spectrum, are they able to talk about their differences? Are they able to, navigate those tough times and have arguments, which is inevitable in the workplace, but in a way that's constructive and positive? It's really important that you look at your conflict resolution skills on your team, because conflict can either be an opportunity for growth or it can destroy a team. And when you're in the midst of a change process, especially where you're losing resources, or you're merging with another organization, or you have a new leadership coming on board, if this issue is not a strength for your team, it can be really problematic for you as a manager. And then last but not least is positive mood, which really is it's just about what is the level of optimism that's present in your team with regard to the change and transition. Is there a sense of humor? Is there a sense of encouraging each other? Okay, we're going to get through this. Another axe coming down, and we have to deal with this. But we're going to get through this. It's going to be okay. We're going to figure it out. Is there that sense on your team? And if there isn't, then as manager, talking with your team about, okay, I know this is difficult, but how do we begin to shift to a place of optimism so that we can deal with what is inevitably going to happen in a more positive way? And that is about communication, communication, communication. So we've covered the 7 elements of Team EQ, and we're almost at the end of the webinar. It went pretty quickly. And what I'd like to do now is open it up for questions before we end with some things that I'd like to summarize and give you some resources. So are there any questions that have come up as you've listened to this information about managing teams through change and transition, looking at the phases of transition using the Williams-Bridges model, or Team IQ? So any questions?
At this time, if you can please go ahead and raise your hand, I will unmute you, but please remember that you must have entered your access code and PIN in order for me to do this. Feel free to also use the question/chat feature if you're more comfortable asking your question that way.
Yeah, so there's been a lot of information given, and so I'm just curious, given that a lot of you are beginning anew, and some of you have said that managing the change has kind of been up and down, so I'm curious what questions there might be.
I'm not seeing any questions from anybody at this moment.
Okay. All right. Well, here's what I'd like to do then is kind of bring it together in terms of strategies for building Team IQ, and maybe you've gotten some ideas to kind of go back and work with your teams around. And that is really important when you're going through a change and transition, or at any time, even if you're not, that there be some discussion about team norms. What are the core values of the team? What's important to the team? What are the ground rules for interacting with one another? Teams need to feel a sense of continuity and agreement about some core things like transparency being a value, that they know from you as manager that you're going to show up and you're going to tell them what's going on, when it's going on, and not waiting to share information, and they in turn are going to agree to do that with you. And I think this can be a really valuable conversation to have, especially when your organization has been impacted by a major change, is to sit down with your team and say, okay, look, this is what's happening. Let's have a conversation about how we're going to manage ourselves through it, and what are our needs? What do we need to support each other? What do we need from you as manager in order to help us navigate this process? The other thing for building Team IQ, and this is so essential, is we spend so much time in teams, in meetings. And, as manager, making sure that the meetings are focused, that people have input on the agenda, that you stick to the agenda, that things are kept on track, and that the information that needs to be addressed in the meetings are being addressed. Because when people feel like, okay, I'm going to go to this meeting and these meetings are valuable, I'm going to get the information I need based on past experience, that's really going to help people manage the process of change and transition, as well as getting people's input. Again, when there has been a big change, a big funding cut, a leadership change, or organizational, merging, people feel out of control because they don't feel like they have a say in what's going on. So that if you solicit people's input, you solicit your team input, it can go a long way, again, in helping to relieve some of the anxiety that's going to be arising during this process. Facilitating shared understanding means asking people, are the changes clear? Do you have concerns? What are those concerns? Do you have some feedback? Any ideas to make us manage this in a better way? Again, that's another way of seeking group input, but it's also a way of making sure that people are on the same page with regards to what's being provided. And then listening skills, really being present, really hearing what people are saying, and paying attention and not listening, and then working on our BlackBerries, which is become the norm. We're so technically advanced now that we tend to be have our attention in many different directions. So really being focused on the person and the people before you. The last thing that I want to say, and I think it's one of the most important things from a managerial standpoint, is that responsibility for managing change is with you as manager. Your employees, their responsibility is to show up, do their jobs, and do their best. But your responsibility is to support them by giving them the information, the support, the training, whatever they need in order to get their jobs done, because you are the person that gets the job done through them. So keeping this in mind, that if your team is not managing the change well, to really take that to heart and to say, okay, what can I do to help them manage that change? Is it I need to go around and have a conversation with each and every person to see how they're doing? Maybe I need to do a survey to get some input. Maybe I need to schedule a team retreat. It could be a barbecue at my home as a way of getting people out of the office because there's been so much stress in the workplace. But really taking that responsibility on, because people and teams need to be empowered during that process, and you are the key focal point for that sense of empowerment. So what we covered today is the impact of organizational change at the team level. We looked at the difference between change, which is the event that happens, and then transition, that's the process of adjusting to the event that has happened. And to that end, we looked at the psychology of change by looking at William Bridges' transition model, which is classic, and the change model, a change curve rather, which talks about the varying emotions that people go through as they're experiencing an ending. They experience, they're in that neutral zone where things are not quite settled yet, and the new beginnings where the change becomes institutionalized. We looked at the issue of team resistance, which is a normal process of change, and some strategies around how to deal with that team resistance, including dealing with difficult employees that might be escalating their behavior during the time of transition, and the importance of communication. And again, I cannot emphasize enough having ongoing communication. We looked at 7 elements of emotionally intelligent teams. I asked you to think about your own teams and where are the strengths, where are the opportunities for growth to go back and strategize. And all of that leads to strategies for successful team management during change and transition. So I want to leave you with a couple of resources for your toolkit. I've already said a few of these that I want to re-mention. Again, Managing Transitions by William Bridges. This is a manual for managers managing change. It's really a great book. I highly recommend it. Another book that I like, I love the Dummy series, and I like it because it's plain English, just really full of ideas, very easy to understand and read, and just a good resource to have on your bookshelf by Beth Everett and Craig Gibble. And then if you want to understand more about the grieving process that people go through when they're undergoing organizational change, a good classic book is the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross book on death and dying. She talks about the dying process, but the same kinds of principles apply with organizational change. And then for emotional intelligence, Daniel Goleman's books are really excellent. Again, very easy to read, very accessible. His work on his book on working with emotional intelligence is an excellent resource that you might want to add to your bookshelf. And there's also a great website, www.eiconsortium.org, which has a lot of information about emotional intelligence in the workplace. So I want to thank you very much. Oh, before I do that, before I end, there is a 3rd webinar that's coming up on April 28th, and we'll be talking about managing change on an organizational level, and we're going to be looking at what are the various change models and determining whether your workplace is ready for the change or their readiness for change, and leading with emotional intelligence, which has other factors involved, and touch upon succession planning which is one of the issues that can come up when we're dealing with managing change and transition. So thank you very much for attending today. Appreciate the opportunity to host this webinar. If you have any questions that you'd like to send to me, I'd be happy to respond to those individually. I can be reached at doris@dorisroach.com. Thank you again.
Thank you, Doris. I'm actually going to have a second ending as well and let you know about how you can access this webinar, the slides, the resources, an actual recorded version of this webinar on our website, which is www.capacityforhealth.org. You can also find and register for any of our upcoming webinars and trainings by going to our upcoming trainings and webinars page. Feel free, obviously, to contact us for any of your capacity building assistance needs. Our information is right there. You may call us at 415-568-3308 or email us at c4h@apiahf.org. One of the many ways that you can keep in touch with us is by signing up for our mailing list. Please go ahead and enter that into the address bar and sign up. And as I mentioned previously, we are funded by CDC to provide free capacity building assistance in a number of different areas. Thank you so much for your participation in today's webinar. And Doris will be staying on for to answer any additional questions you might have. Thank you and have a wonderful day.